The economic and financial data cited in this video, including U.S. national debt figures, Strait of Hormuz oil flow percentages, Russian frozen asset totals, and China's energy import dependency, are sourced from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the U.S. Treasury, the Congressional Budget Office, the International Energy Agency, and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. Full source list is in the video description. All right, let's dive in. You know what genuinely gets to me? Not the missiles, not the body count. What gets to me is filling up my gas tank and actually knowing, that the number on that pump has something to do with decisions made in rooms I will never see, by people who will never explain themselves honestly, for reasons that have nothing to do with what they told you on the news last night. That is what I want to talk about today, because I have been watching this war the way I have watched every war I have ever been involved in or studied, which is to say, I have been watching what the people in charge are doing rather than listening to what they are saying. And what they are doing tells a completely different story than what they are saying. They told you this war is about Iran's nuclear program. I am telling you, it was never about Iran's nuclear program. The nuclear program was the label on the box. What is actually in the box is something they cannot say out loud without the entire thing unraveling. So let me say it for them. The answer is in two numbers that you have probably seen separately and never connected. $39 trillion, the current American national debt, and 20%, the share of global daily oil supply that moves through the Strait of Hormuz. Those are not two separate stories. That is one story. And once you see how they connect, you will not be able to watch the coverage of this war the same way again. Let me explain the architecture. Since 1973, global oil trade has been denominated in American dollars. That arrangement, what economists call the Petrodollar system, is the foundation on which American financial power rests. It is why the United States can run a $39 trillion debt without the kind of currency collapse that would destroy any other country in the same position. The mechanism is straightforward. Every nation that needs oil must first acquire dollars to buy it. That creates permanent structural global demand for the American currency, regardless of what the American economy is actually producing. It is why Japan holds dollars. It is why South Korea holds dollars. It is why every government in the Gulf holds dollars, not because they love America, because they need oil, and oil costs dollars. Now, here is what started breaking that system. In February 2022, the United States froze over $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets following the invasion of Ukraine. And I want you to understand what that decision communicated to every finance ministry and central bank on the planet that was not in the NATO alliance. It communicated that the dollar is not a neutral reserve currency. It is a weapon. And if Washington can weaponize the dollar against Russia today, it can weaponize it against anyone tomorrow. The exodus from American treasuries that followed was not panic. It was rational portfolio management by governments that had just received a demonstration of what American financial power looks like when the relationship goes bad. China accelerated its shift toward gold. The BRICS framework began serious work on alternative settlement mechanisms. Saudi Arabia started accepting yuan for oil sales to China. Each of those moves was a government deciding that the petrodollar's guarantee of neutrality had been revoked by the people who issued the guarantee. And here is why that matters for everything happening in the Persian Gulf right now. If the petrodollar system collapses, the mechanism that allows the United States to carry $39 trillion in debt without a currency crisis collapses with it. If the rest of the world stops needing dollars to buy oil, the demand that sustains the dollar as a reserve currency evaporates. And if that demand evaporates, the United States faces a fiscal reckoning that no amount of domestic policy can manage. The petrodollar is not just an economic convenience. It is the oxygen supply of the American empire. And the people making military decisions in Washington understand this with complete clarity, even if they will never say it in a congressional hearing or a press conference. So what do you do when the petrodollar is losing legitimacy as a neutral reserve instrument? You do not fix the legitimacy problem, because fixing it would require abandoning the weaponization of the dollar that created the problem in the first place. What you do instead is ensure that the alternative to the petrodollar cannot function. And the alternative to the petrodollar requires one thing above everything else: an energy supply that is not controlled by the United States or subject to American interdiction. That is what Iran represents, not a nuclear threat, an energy corridor outside American control. Iran sits at the junction of the energy architecture that would make a non-dollar global trading system viable. It connects Russian energy southward through the international north-south transport corridor. It connects Central Asian resources to the Indian Ocean. It is a critical node in the Belt and Road Initiative that China has invested $200 billion building across the Middle East and Central Asia. And it controls the Strait of Hormuz, which carries 20% of global daily oil supply and through which China receives approximately 60% of its energy needs. If you are an American strategic planner trying to prevent the emergence of a credible alternative to the petrodollar, Iran is the keystone you pull. Pull it, and the alternative architecture becomes non-functional. The energy corridors that bypass American maritime control do not work without Iran in them. The Belt and Road Initiative's Persian Gulf connectivity collapses. The international north-south transport corridor loses its southern access point, and China, which has structured its entire energy import strategy around Middle Eastern supply, finds itself in a crisis of dependency that forces it back toward American-controlled energy sources. Look at what the targeting in this conflict has actually prioritized. Not just missile factories, not just nuclear facilities, railways, ports on the Caspian, road infrastructure, the physical connective tissue of the trade corridors that Iran anchors. When Israel and American aircraft destroy an Iranian railway junction, they are not targeting a military asset in any conventional sense. They are targeting the Belt and Road Initiative. They are targeting the North-South corridor. They are targeting the physical infrastructure whose existence makes it possible for Russia, Iran, and China to build a trading system that does not require American dollar clearance. And if you think that is too cynical an interpretation, look at what came before Iran in this sequence. Venezuela. The United States deployed naval assets to the Caribbean and effectively blockaded Venezuelan energy exports. Venezuela is not a nuclear threat. Venezuela is the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, and it was conducting its transactions with China and Russia outside the dollar system. The template is visible once you know what you are looking at. Identify the node in the non-dollar energy architecture. Apply military or naval pressure to disable it. Ensure that the energy it was supplying must now come from North American sources, which are sold in dollars. Repeat, Iran is not an aberration in this sequence. Iran is the most important application of this logic, yet attempted, because Iran is the most consequential node in the architecture. Now, let me tell you about China specifically, because China's position in this conflict is the analytical key that unlocks the end game, and it is being systematically underreported in the Western coverage of the war. China receives approximately 60% of its total energy needs from the Middle East. Of Iranian oil exports, China purchases roughly 90%. China has invested $200 billion in Middle Eastern infrastructure as part of the Belt and Road Initiative. And China's access to all of that energy travels through the Strait of Hormuz, which Iran controls, and through the Strait of Malacca, which Indonesia and Malaysia control, and which American naval assets can interdict. That last point is the one that does not appear in the American media coverage, and that the Chinese strategic planning community has been grappling with since this conflict began. The Strait of Malacca is the choke point through which virtually all Middle Eastern energy bound for East Asia must eventually pass. The Strait of Hormuz is where that energy enters the sea lanes. Malacca is where it completes the journey. If the United States controls both ends of that route, China's energy supply is held hostage regardless of what Iran does or does not agree to. And Indonesia and Malaysia, whatever their independent foreign policy preferences, are deeply entangled with American military and intelligence relationships in ways that make Malacca a genuinely viable pressure point for Washington to exploit if the strategic calculation demands it. This is the trap that China finds itself in. Its energy strategy was built on access to Middle Eastern supply at discounted prices, made possible by the sanctions that isolated Iran, Russia, and Venezuela from Western markets. Those three sanctioned states were supplying China at prices no unsanctioned supplier could match. Now that supply is being disrupted, degraded, and in the case of Iran, actively targeted, and China has no short-term alternative. You cannot reroute 60% of your energy supply in weeks or months. You cannot replace Iranian oil with Australian LNG on a timeline measured in anything less than years of infrastructure development. In the short term, China has no choice but to manage the crisis through whatever accommodation with Washington the current moment allows. And Washington knows this: the ceasefire negotiations, the framework discussions, the various diplomatic engagements that have been announced and then collapsed. None of them are primarily about the military situation in Iran. They are about whether China will agree to redirect its energy purchasing toward North American LNG, toward American-aligned Gulf state production, toward suppliers whose transactions will be denominated in dollars. If China agrees to that redirection, the petrodollar gains a new lease on life. American energy producers benefit enormously. The alternative trading architecture that BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative were building loses its most important customer. And all of that comes at the price of Iran, which China would be implicitly accepting as a cost worth paying for energy security. Whether China will actually accept that trade is the open question at the center of the current conflict. And here's what I think the evidence shows. The fact that Iran agreed to send a high-level delegation to negotiations it had every reason to distrust suggests that Chinese pressure was applied. Iran does not send its foreign minister into a meeting it believes is a trap without receiving assurances from someone whose assurances it values. China is the only actor in this situation whose assurances Iran would value enough to take that risk, which means China is engaged in the diplomatic process at a deeper level than is visible in public statements, which means the war's ultimate resolution, if there is one, will be shaped by a China-American negotiation that is happening in parallel with and largely invisible to the Iran-American negotiation everyone is watching. The price of that negotiation, if it produces an agreement, is the dismantling of the energy corridor architecture that Belt and Road was building. That is what Washington wants. That is what the targeting of Iranian railways and Caspian ports is designed to deliver before any agreement is reached. You destroy the infrastructure first, then you negotiate, because infrastructure destroyed in wartime is much harder to rebuild under a peace agreement than infrastructure that survived intact. Now, let me address the domestic American dimension of this, because it does not operate separately from the strategic picture, and understanding it explains why there is no serious political opposition to this war inside the United States. The $39 trillion debt is not an abstract number. It is a constraint that shapes every policy decision the American government makes. Servicing that debt requires maintaining global demand for dollars. Maintaining global demand for dollars requires maintaining the petrodollar, and maintaining the petrodollar in an environment where the weaponization of the dollar has already prompted a global shift toward alternatives requires ensuring that those alternatives cannot function. The war in Iran is not a choice that any one administration made independently. It is a response to a structural crisis in American finances that has been building for decades and that no administration of either party has been willing to confront honestly. The Democrats did not oppose this war in any meaningful way because the Democrats benefit from the same petrodollar system that the war is designed to protect. Wall Street benefits, the financial industry benefits, every institution whose prosperity depends on continued global demand for dollar-denominated assets benefits. The anti-war sentiment in the American public is real. The majority of Americans did not want this conflict. But the political system that is supposed to translate public preference into policy is not structured to translate this particular preference, because the institutional interests that benefit from the petrodollar are the same institutional interests that fund both parties. This is not a conspiracy. It is an alignment of incentives. And understanding it tells you why the opposition to this war inside the United States is insufficient to stop it, even as the costs become impossible to ignore at the kitchen table level: the gas prices, the grocery bills, the fertilizer costs hitting farmers during the planting window. All of it flows directly from what is happening in the Persian Gulf. All of it is the American domestic economy absorbing the cost of a policy designed to protect the financial architecture that allows the American government to borrow at scales that would be unsustainable without the petrodollar. The American taxpayer is not being asked to pay for this war through taxes. They are being asked to pay for it through inflation, through energy costs, through the compounding price pressures that flow from a 20% disruption to global oil supply. That is the mechanism by which the cost of maintaining the petrodollar is transferred from the institutions that benefit from it to the households that do not. And none of the people explaining the war on television are going to explain that to you. They will explain the military situation. They will explain the diplomatic situation. They will explain the humanitarian situation. What they will not explain is the financial architecture that the military action is designed to protect, because explaining it requires acknowledging that the war has nothing to do with the justification that was given for starting it. What comes next, in the medium term, is a continuation of the logic I have described. The railroads will continue to be targeted. The energy corridor infrastructure will continue to be degraded. The pressure on China will continue to be applied through the dual choke point of Hormuz and Malacca. The diplomatic process will continue to oscillate between apparent progress and collapse, because the apparent progress is designed to extract concessions and the collapse is designed to resume the pressure. What comes next in the long term is less certain and more consequential, because the strategy I have described has a fatal structural flaw. It works in the short term by forcing accommodations from adversaries who have no immediate alternative, but every forced accommodation is also a lesson in why you need alternatives. China is investing right now, under the pressure of this crisis, in exactly the kind of long-range energy infrastructure, alternative navigation corridors, and non-dollar settlement mechanisms that the crisis is designed to prevent. Russia is developing the kind of naval capacity designed to contest American maritime interdiction. The world is not passively absorbing American piracy. It is studying it, modeling it, and building the architecture that makes it less decisive in a decade. The petrodollar strategy can buy time. It cannot buy permanent resolution, because the underlying dynamic, an American financial system that requires the entire world to need dollars in order to remain solvent, is not a sustainable equilibrium. It is a system that works until enough of the world finds a way around it, and every aggressive application of military force to defend it sends every government watching the signal that finding a way around it is a strategic necessity. The war in Iran is the most aggressive and most expensive application of the petrodollar defense strategy yet attempted. Whether it succeeds in its actual objective depends on whether China can be brought into an accommodation before it completes the alternative infrastructure that would make the accommodation unnecessary. That is the race at the center of everything you are watching. Not the missile exchanges, not the ceasefire negotiations. The race between American military disruption of the alternative energy architecture and China's construction of the alternative energy architecture. Everything else is noise around that signal.